I am the Duke of Thornfield, and I have been feared since I was 17 years old. That is not a boast. It is a fact recorded in the whispers of 3 counties, in the silence that falls over a drawing room when my name is spoken, in the way mothers steer their daughters to the far end of the ballroom when I enter. I inherited the title young, buried my father younger, and built Thornfield into the largest estate in the north, through methods the polite world preferred not to examine too closely. I was not cruel, I was exact, and exactness, in a world that runs on charm, is a species of cruelty all its own. By the age of 32, I had no wife, no heir, and no particular interest in acquiring either, until my mother informed me, over breakfast, that she had arranged the match herself. "Miss Sophia Ashford," she said, setting her teacup down with the decisive click of a woman who has already won. The younger daughter, exquisite, accomplished, the toast of 2 seasons. I did not argue. My mother had earned the right to arrange what she wished. She had kept Thornfield together during my father's decline with nothing but nerve and a ledger book. If she said Sophia Ashford would do, then Sophia Ashford would do. I met the girl once, at a supper arranged to seal the contract. She was beautiful. I will grant her that without reservation. Pale gold hair, a laugh that carried across a room, a way of tilting her chin that made every man within sight believe he was the only one she saw. She looked at me with wide blue eyes and said, "Your Grace," and curtsied with the practiced grace of a woman who has curtsied 1,000 times. And I thought, yes, this will serve. Her elder sister sat at the far end of the table. Dark hair, plain dress, quiet hands. She was reading the label on the wine bottle when she thought no one was looking. I did not think about her again. No one thought about her. The wedding was set for the 23rd of June at St. Michael's in Ashford, a cathedral of golden stone that my mother had filled with white roses and enough candles to light a small village. Half the county filled the pews. The bishop wore his finest vestments. My brother Richard stood beside me as witness, fidgeting with his cuffs, and I waited at the altar with the patience of a man who has learned that waiting is simply another form of control. The doors opened, and the wrong woman walked in. She came alone, which was the first strangeness. No father on her arm, no attendants, no veil, no processional. Just a woman in a gray traveling dress, her dark hair pulled back from a face that was, I will say it plainly, not beautiful. Not ugly either. A quiet face, the kind of face you would pass in a corridor and forget before you reach the end of it. She walked the length of the nave with her spine very straight and her hands clasped in front of her, and she stopped 3 steps from the altar and said, in a voice that barely carried to the front pew, "She is gone. Sophia is gone. She left before dawn." The cathedral erupted. My mother's hand found my arm, her grip like iron. Richard swore under his breath. The Ashford family in the second pew dissolved into a tableau of muted horror, the mother pressing a handkerchief to her mouth, the father half risen from his seat, his face the color of ash. I looked at the woman standing before me, the elder daughter, the one who kept the household accounts and read too much, and had never received a single proposal in her life. "What is your name?" I said. She blinked. "Margaret, Your Grace. Margaret Ashford." Behind her, her father was already moving, already calculating. I could see it in the set of his jaw, the desperate arithmetic of a man who has staked his family's future on a match and is watching it collapse. He reached his elder daughter's side and gripped her elbow with a possessiveness that made her stiffen. "She will stand," he said to me, his voice raw with urgency. "Margaret will stand. The contract specifies a daughter of the house, any daughter of the house. The terms hold. The dowry holds. She will marry you today, Your Grace, if you will have her." Margaret Ashford turned to her father with an expression I have never forgotten. Not anger, not humiliation, something quieter than both. A recognition, old and deep, as though she had always known this was where the world would put her, in the gap her sister left behind, asked to fill a shape she was never meant to fit. She looked at me. "I am not Sophia," she said. "No," I said, "you are not." I studied this woman, this gray, quiet, unremarkable woman, and I made the most precise calculation of my life. She had walked into a cathedral full of strangers, alone, wearing a traveling dress among the silk and roses, to deliver news that would humiliate her family, because someone had to deliver it, and no one else would. That took nerve. Nerve, I understood. "You will do," I said. She flinched. A small, contained movement, barely visible. Then she lifted her chin, and I saw, for the first time, that her eyes were not gray at all. They were a deep, clear brown, steady as heartwood, and there was nothing resigned in them, only a calm, unflinching assessment of me that I was not accustomed to receiving from anyone. "How flattering," she said. We were married within the hour. She signed the register in a hand that did not shake. I slid my mother's ring onto her finger, and she looked at it as though it were a sentence, not a gift. The congregation watched in stupefied silence. My mother wept into her handkerchief. The bishop, to his credit, said nothing beyond the rite. By sundown, Margaret Ashford was the Duchess of Thornfield. She was nothing like what I expected, which is to say, she was nothing at all like Sophia. She did not try to charm me. She did not redecorate the house, or host dinners, or make herself agreeable to my mother's friends. She rose before dawn, walked the grounds in all weather. I saw her from my study window one morning striding through a downpour, as though the rain were a minor inconvenience beneath her attention, and spent her evenings in the library with a candle, a pot of tea, and whatever volume she had pulled from the shelves. She asked nothing of me. She made no demands, no complaints, no requests. She moved through Thornfield like a woman who understood precisely the terms of her presence, and had decided that if she could not be wanted, she would at least not be a burden. I told myself I was satisfied with the arrangement. The contract was fulfilled. The estate had its duchess. I could return to my ledgers, my tenants, and my reputation for exactness, and we could pass the next 20 years under the same roof, without troubling each other. That lasted 11 days. On the 12th morning, I found her in the kitchen garden at dawn, kneeling in the dirt with my housekeeper, Mrs. Garrett, a woman who had served Thornfield for 30 years, and who had not, to my knowledge, smiled since the old Duke died. They were planting something. Mrs. Garrett was laughing, actually laughing. The sound was so foreign in that house that I stopped in the doorway and stood there, like a man who has walked into the wrong room. Margaret looked up, saw me, and said, with soil on her hands and a streak of it across her cheek, "The soil here is extraordinary, Your Grace. You could grow anything." I said nothing. I went back to my study, but I left the door open, and I could hear her voice drifting in from the garden all morning, low and warm and certain of itself, and I could not make myself close it. On the 14th day, my steward reported that she had visited every tenant cottage on the eastern boundary, the ones I had been meaning to inspect since spring, and had compiled a list of repairs ranked by urgency. The roof at Haddon Row was first. She was right. It had been leaking for 6 months while I delayed, and she had identified it in a fortnight. I called her to my study. She stood before my desk with her hands folded, expecting, I think, to be reprimanded. "You visited the tenants," I said. "I walked the grounds. The tenants were on the grounds. The roof at Haddon Row. The woman who lives there has a cough that will not clear. The damp is the cause. If the repair waits another month, she will be worse." I sent the builders the next morning. Margaret never mentioned it again, but Mrs. Garrett told me, weeks later, that the Duchess had brought broth to the woman at Haddon Row every day until the roof was finished. In the 3rd week, she reorganized my library, not the arrangement, the catalog. She had found errors in the indexing that my secretary had maintained for a decade, and she had corrected them, quietly, without asking permission, in a hand so meticulous it put his to shame. When I discovered it, I stood in front of the shelves for a long time, running my finger along the new labels, and I felt something shift in my chest, a loosening, like a bolt being turned that had been rusted in place for years. One afternoon, I came upon her in the corridor outside the servants' hall. She was speaking to Mrs. Garrett in a low voice, and when I turned the corner, they both fell silent. Mrs. Garrett curtsied and withdrew. Margaret smoothed her skirts and met my eyes. "What were you discussing?" I asked. The kitchen maids. The youngest one has been unwell. I arranged for the doctor in the village. You might have told me. You were occupied with the harvest accounts. And she is my concern now, is she not? I am the Duchess. She said it without defiance, without pride. She said it as though she were trying the word on like a garment she was not yet certain fit her, and had found, to her own quiet surprise, that it did. I stood in that corridor after she left, and realized I could not remember what the harvest accounts had said. In the 4th week, I began finding excuses to be in rooms where she was. I would walk to the morning room because the light was better there, and she would be reading by the window. I would visit the garden to speak to the groundsman, and she would be tending the herbs she had planted, her sleeves pushed back, her hair escaping its pins. I would take my coffee in the library, and she would be at the desk, writing letters in that careful hand, and she would look up and say, "Good morning, Your Grace," and I would say, "Good morning, Margaret," and the sound of her name in my own voice would unsettle me for the rest of the day. She never called me by my Christian name. She never touched me. Not a hand on my arm, not a brush of fingers passing a book. She kept herself at a careful, precise distance, as though she had drawn a line on the floor between us, and was determined never to cross it. I began to hate that line. The 5th week brought the Midsummer Assembly at Ashford Hall, the first event at which the new Duchess of Thornfield would be presented to the county. Margaret came downstairs in a gown I had never seen, deep blue, simply cut, with no jewels, no adornment. She had not asked for new gowns. She had altered one of her own. "You look well," I said, and meant it more than she could know. She raised one eyebrow. "You seem surprised." "I am not surprised. I am noting." "Noting," she repeated, and the corner of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile, but was better than most people's best attempts at one. At the assembly, the county stared. They whispered behind fans. The plain sister, the substitute bride, the wrong Ashford. Margaret moved through the room with her back straight and her head level, and she spoke to the tenants' wives as easily as she spoke to the bishop's wife, and she remembered every name, and she asked after every ailing parent and wayward son, as though she had lived among them for years and not weeks. No one had taught her to do this. No one had needed to. I watched from the far wall, a glass of wine untouched in my hand, and I understood with a clarity that felt like standing in bright sunlight after years in a darkened room that this woman was not filling her sister's place. She was occupying her own, and it was larger. When the dancing began, I crossed the floor and offered my hand. The room went quiet. She looked at my hand, then at my face, and said, "I should warn you, Your Grace, I am not a graceful dancer." "Neither am I said. "We will stumble together." We danced, badly, and for the first time in my life, I did not mind that a room full of people was watching me do something imperfectly. One evening in July, a thunderstorm broke over Thornfield with a violence that rattled every window in the house. I was reading in the library when the door opened and Margaret came in, damp from the corridor, carrying a candle the draft had nearly killed. She did not see me at first. She crossed to the far window, set the candle on the sill, and stood watching the lightning over the fields with an expression of such unguarded wonder that I felt I was seeing someone she had never shown to anyone. Then the thunder cracked, close and sharp, and she flinched, and she turned and saw me, and the wonder vanished behind her composure, so quickly it was as though I had imagined it. "Forgive me," she said. "I did not know you were here." "Stay," I said. The word came out before I could measure it. She stayed. She sat in the chair across from mine and opened her book, and we read in silence while the storm threw itself against the glass. And I thought, this is the most peace I have known in this house since my father died. "You are staring again," she said the following evening, without looking up from her book. I was not staring, I was considering. Considering what? Why you are not afraid of me. She looked up then. Those brown eyes, steady as heartwood. Should I be? Everyone else is. Everyone else does not live with you, she said. Fear is difficult to sustain across a breakfast table. You take your eggs the same way every morning. Your Grace, it is hard to fear a man whose habits you can predict. I laughed. I had not laughed in Thornfield in, I could not remember how long. The sound startled us both. The beautiful sister came back in August. Sophia arrived in a hired carriage, thinner than she had been, with shadows beneath her lovely eyes, and a story I did not care to hear. The man she had run to, a captain, a charmer, a creature made entirely of promises, had proven to be exactly what such men always prove to be. She had crawled back to her family, and her family had sent her to Thornfield to beg. She stood in my drawing room and wept, gracefully, beautifully, the way women like Sophia weep when they know they are being watched, and said she was sorry, she had been foolish, she was the one I was meant to marry, and surely the mistake could be undone. My mother sat in her chair by the fire, watching me with an expression I had learned to read over 32 years. She was waiting to see what I was made of. Richard stood by the window with his arms crossed. He had spent the summer watching me watch Margaret across the dinner table. He already knew. Sophia's father stood behind his younger daughter, nodding vigorously. An annulment, he said. The original contract specified Sophia. Margaret was a temporary measure. Surely, Your Grace, you can see that the original arrangement, I said, specified a daughter of the Ashford house. I married a daughter of the Ashford house. But Margaret is... He stopped. He looked at me and recalculated. I could see the moment he understood that he was not negotiating with a man who could be moved. She is the plain one, he finished, weakly, as though that settled it. I heard a sound behind me, the scrape of a chair. I turned and saw Margaret in the doorway. She had come in quietly, as she always did. She had a way of entering rooms the way dawn enters a window, without announcement, and she had heard every word. She looked at her father, she looked at her sister, and then she looked at me, and I watched her assemble her dignity around herself like armor. The quiet, fierce, practiced dignity of a woman who had spent her entire life being the one who was not chosen. I will go, she said. Her voice was perfectly steady. If it is what you want, I will sign whatever papers are required. The room went still. I looked at this woman who had walked into a cathedral alone and told the truth when no one else would, who had planted a garden in my kitchen yard and corrected my library and mended the roof at Haddon Row and brought broth to a sick tenant and made my housekeeper laugh for the first time in a decade, who sat across from me every morning and was not afraid of me and called me Your Grace and never touched me and never asked for anything, and who was, I realized in that thunderstruck moment, the finest person I had ever known. Margaret, I said. She flinched. That same small, contained movement. I did not claim the wrong bride. I said it to the room, to her father, to the beautiful weeping sister, to my mother by the fire, to every person who had ever looked past this woman and seen nothing worth stopping for. I claimed the only woman who has ever entered this house and made it worth living in. I crossed the drawing room. I took her hand, the first time I had ever touched her, and I felt her fingers trembling beneath mine, and I held them until they were still. You are not a temporary measure, I said. You are not a substitute. You are not the plain one. You are the Duchess of Thornfield, and I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for the morning your sister had the good sense to run. She looked up at me. Her eyes were full, but she did not weep. She was not the kind of woman who wept. That, she said, is considerably more flattering. My mother set down her tea and smiled, the small, private, triumphant smile of a woman who has been waiting 11 weeks for her son to say the thing she already knew. Sophia left Thornfield that afternoon with her father. I did not see either of them again for a very long time, and when I did, it was Margaret who greeted them at the door. Composed, generous, impeccable, because that is who she is, and who she has always been. That evening, I found her in the kitchen garden, kneeling beside the rosemary she had planted in June, and I knelt beside her in the dirt in my good coat, and she said, "You will ruin it." And I said, "Margaret, I have ruined far more important things than a coat." And she laughed, a real laugh, low and warm, and startled out of her, and I kissed her there, among the herbs and the evening light, with the soil of Thornfield under both our knees. She called me by my name for the first time that night, not Your Grace, not Thornfield, my name, and I understood that I had not been feared at all. Not by her, not ever. I had been waited for, patiently, quietly, without demand or expectation, by a woman who had learned long ago that the world would not choose her, and who had decided, with a courage I am still learning to match, that she would be worth choosing anyway. Her sister fled the altar. I claimed the wrong bride. And it was the only right thing I have ever done.